I'm going to begin just by reading a little bit from the book. So I'm going to read from the chapter that's called Coda, The Politics of Desire. And as the name suggests, it's a coda to the title essay of the book, The Right to Sex, which was originally published in the London Review of Books and is a meditation on the kind of politics of sexual desire and sexual entitlement. And the coda is a series of numbered thoughts. So I'm going to start with number 3. After the original publication of my Right to Sex essay, one feminist tweeted, "Could we please stop discussing whether or not there is a right to sex? Of course there is not. There is a right not to be raped. Enough hand-wringing, the end." As a small addendum, she added, quote, "The observation that the extent to which one gets what one wants out of life in any domain is often largely a matter of luck and happenstance and privilege and characteristics you don't have control over is about as banal as it gets." 4. There is no right to sex. To think otherwise is to think like a rapist. But is it as banal as it gets to observe that what is ugliest about our social realities, racism, classism, ableism, heteronormativity, shapes who we do and do not desire and love, and who does and does not desire and love us? 5. That would be news to the people of color and the working class, queer, and disabled people who have drawn a clear connection between the more obvious public dimensions of their oppression and the more hidden private mechanisms that enable and partly constitute it, including the mechanisms of the club, the dating app, the bedroom, the school dance. 6. I have a friend who explains that because she is Black and despite being beautiful and otherwise popular, she was simply off the table when it came to dating in her predominantly white prep school. 7. It would also be news to the feminists who have long demanded that we see sex as we know it, not as some primordial pre-political given, but as an effect of politics, all too easily and falsely naturalized. The task was to liberate sex from the distortions of oppression, not simply to divide it into the consensual, unproblematic, and non-consensual, problematic. 8. Indeed, what is male sexual entitlement? The false conviction that men have a right to sex, a right that they can coercively enforce, if not a paradigm of how politics shapes sexual desire. Can we position ourselves against male sexual entitlement to women's bodies in general, and against the misogynistic fetishization of the hot blonde slut or sexy East Asian doll or the vulnerable child's body, without opening ourselves to a political critique of sex? 9. To liberate sex from the distortions of oppression is not the same as just saying everyone can desire whatever or whomever they want. The first is a radical demand. The second is a liberal one. Like many liberal demands, the second is often fueled by an individualist suspicion of the coercive power of the community. If my desire must be disciplined, who will do the disciplining? And if my desire refuses to be disciplined, what will happen to me then? 10. I'm not saying such worries are ungrounded. It is not perverse to want to be left alone. 11. Except properly understood, the radical demand that we liberate sex from the distortions of oppression is not about disciplining desire at all. When I wrote that, quote, desire can cut against what politics has chosen for us and choose for itself, I was not imagining a desire regulated by the demands of justice, but a desire set free from the binds of injustice. I'm asking what might happen if we were to look at bodies, our own and others, and allow ourselves to feel admiration, appreciation, want, where politics tells us we should not. There is a kind of discipline here, in that it requires us to quiet the voices that have spoken to us since birth, the voices that tell us which bodies and ways of being in the world are worthy and which are unworthy. What is disciplined here isn't desire itself, but the political forces that presume to instruct it. 12. After my piece was published, a gay man wrote to me about his husband of 14 years, a large fat man, he explained, whom he loves deeply and with whom he has a satisfying sex life. And yet he has had, quote, to work deliberately and consciously to let him be sexy, if that makes sense. He went on, quote, while we cannot alter what does and does not turn us on, we can on the one hand displace what might be getting in the way of erotic excitement, and on the other teach ourselves to eroticize what is happening in front of us during sex. 13. Is this an act of discipline or of love?
Thank you so much. I finished the book just this week and I was thrilled. I should say, I think the first piece I read by Amia was about the octopus. And there was this sort of lovely, I was not alone in loving this essay, a sort of like wonderful way where you kept coming at this alien intelligence sort of sideways and trying to figure out how can we get inside the mind of this obviously intelligent other creature. And in reading this book, I was like, aha, here are all these subjects which have become incredibly fraught in the public discourse, professor-student relationships, consent, in such a way, in typical sort of conversation right now, make my brain kind of like clench shut and be like, please leave me alone. This discourse is so horrible and unproductive. And I felt like this book allowed my brain to open up again. It was so lovely and well done and also funny, which is something we don't get a lot of right now. And so I wanted to start sort of where you left off, which is you've raised this contradiction, which makes people quite uncomfortable, which is, you know, on the one hand, no one owes sex to anybody else. We can all agree. On the other hand, our desires are obviously shaped by all these political forces, many of which we think are bad. So what do we do with that? And one of the things we've tried to think about a lot at Lux is, you know, how do we imagine a world where not just, you know, we can all survive, but everyone can have pleasure, everyone can have a good life. And a lot of the socialist answers to that have been, well, you know, sex is better under socialism because, you know, you have the resources you need in life, you have healthcare, you have a place to live. You're not scared that if you break up with your partner, your finances are going to be a disaster. It's a safer world in certain ways, and one more conducive to pleasure. But I wonder if those sorts of answers are at all satisfying to you, or if we're trying to sort of like solve a Freudian problem with Marx. I'm curious kind of what you've made of this, these sort of socialist attempts to sort out how we might live in a world where people have greater access to pleasure.
You cut out for a small moment because apparently my internet connection is unstable. Zoom is telling me, oh God. But I think I got the gist of it. You can come back to me if I haven't. First, let me just say I'm so glad you mentioned Lux. Everyone who's here, if you're not already a subscriber, you absolutely should be. It's an extraordinary magazine and venture, and one that, you know, is deadly serious politically, but also full of feminist joy and pleasure, and that's a really, really wonderful thing. So please do go subscribe, and congratulations to you, Sarah, for bringing this thing into the world. So, I mean, I'm a socialist, and I broadly think that socialist forms of life and socialist forms of political life are, you know, more conducive to sexual justice and gender justice in general. But I am sympathetic to the worry, which you so neatly put in terms of, you know, trying to solve a Freudian problem with Marx. So I think you actually can solve some Freudian problems with Marx. So there are the kind of more material connections that you were talking about, right? So, well, what does it actually look like when people aren't materially, especially women, children, aren't materially entrapped in the home, right, and aren't materially entrapped of necessity in the nuclear family, right? I mean, if you really wanted to deal with the crisis of domestic violence, that would be the first question you would ask. You wouldn't be asking yourself, like, how do we get more men in prison? You would think about, why is it that so many women can't afford to leave? And in fact, so many women don't want their husbands or partners in prison, right? Because then they can't afford to, like, pay their rent or feed their children. So there's no doubt that the vulnerability and the disproportionate vulnerability that certain women especially face in relation to gendered forms of violence can be addressed by, like, broadly speaking, socialist solutions. But that's, I mean, but, I don't think that sexual subordination and gender injustice in general is just reducible to these kind of, even broadly speaking, economic realities. But one thing I do have faith in is what women can do when they have more time, right? So I think the interesting question is, well, what would women do if, especially working class women, do if they just had more time and had more leisure, and were safer along the dimensions that you were thinking about? So in terms of healthcare, accommodation, housing, employment, universal basic income, what would they do with that time? And I think I would like to think, I think it's almost certainly true that we would spend time thinking about how to alter basic relations with men, which, I don't think is simply a matter of kind of social policy issues or but uh, but it's something that, and something that requires certain forms of, Freudian renegotiation of the terms of, like, basic engagement. But there's an interesting connection here. I mean, so someone like Adrienne Rich, for example, and Firestone also thinks this, that childcare is not only something that's a desperate, immediate material need for women, right, to emancipate them from the drudgery of, like, the home and family life, but also something that has this profound liberatory potential, because it would, in a certain form, bring men into the work of social reproduction, right? And for someone like Adrienne Rich, I mean, she thinks what that would mean is that men could no longer really be children, right? They would have to, in some sense, grow up themselves, because they would now be charged with, raising children and nurturing children. So there are also these demands that I think are not just non-reformist reforms, but actually, start off Marxist and then maybe have a kind of more Freudian, directionality to them.
Something that was really interesting, especially in the Coda, was the ways in which feminists, among others, responded to your first essay, as you said, or the initial essay. And there's a real sense of risk, like it might be risky to suggest that our desires are not, are not natural, are up for discussion. There's a risk about them being up for discussion somehow. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you think people perceive those risks to be, because I think actually the types of essays in your book are unusual right now. And it's because people don't really want to hold desire up as something contestable, maybe. So I wonder if, and I have some questions about that, but I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about what you think the risks are.
So I think there are some very real political risks that's very important to get onto the table. And so one way into this is just by thinking about the very important central role that a rhetoric of innateness and non-malleability has played in, like, the gay and queer and trans liberation movement, right? So it has been very important against a conservative cultural backdrop that will only not blame you for certain non-normative things if you just can't help it, right? To insist that forms of queer desire, queer identity are just innate, given, unchangeable. and so, and thus you have people, when you have had queer people who don't, want to account for themselves using a kind of very simple born this way narrative, you often get a certain amount of backlash from, queer activists themselves. And you saw this when Cynthia Nixon in, I think it was 2012, said, I've been straight and I've been gay, and gay is better, right? And she was kind of hearkening back to this more sort of 70s way of thinking about lesbianism as something that like one might choose it, right? And she was blurring deliberately the line between desire and choice, right? And she was, I read her as thinking, look, you have lots of different desires and you can kind of avow certain ones, in part because you find them to be, to be, consonant with the kind of political and social life that you want to be living, right? But she faced a big backlash, but I don't think she would if she had said that now, right? So I think there is a kind of shift here, and that itself is interesting. So, but nonetheless, so I think there can be a certain worry about being sort of too honest and open about the role, the kind of complex relationship between choice, desire, identity, avowal, and things like that. Because of the precarity of like queer liberation and queer rights. And I also think there's an anxiety about just like authoritarian moralism, right? So if it turns out that we can exercise some control over our desires, then does that mean that all of us who have sort of politically incorrect desires are failing and need to be held account? And do we all need to be engaged in some kind of Maoist self-flagellation exercise? And it's not like that has never happened historically, right? There have been moments in fairly recent feminist history where certain feminists have engaged in that kind of moral interrogation, not just of themselves, but of other feminists. And certain women have found that extremely off-putting, right? So there's the question of alienation. But I also think just a lot of people just don't want to have to think about, they just want, they have some sense of them, like there's a certain kind of exculpatory move that they want to make from the very beginning, because it just is not very comfortable for them to think about, well, how might I go on if it turns out that in some sense my desire is not just a perfectly fixed thing.
Right, the stakes are sort of high. I mean, you imagine a world in which it was perfectly fine to both avow your desire and for that desire to change or evolve or to be chosen. And it is a bit of a conservative nightmare. I mean, queer desire running rampant,
Yeah.
without rules, is like a sort of shocking in the American context, or really maybe most. And it was interesting to me, in your book, you have folks who are leftists, who have some political experience, whose immediate fear is that saying that desire can change will mean that we'll have some sort of like authoritarian dictates of like, you have to choose the right desire. But for your students, it actually seemed extremely different. It seemed like almost the opposite, where you have an amazing chapter about talking to your students about porn, something which seems like a difficult thing to do well, but a really, really interesting conversation, and some of what they're suggesting, and of course, keeping in mind that they don't have as much experience in the world. So whatever may be happening in that given moment, at least if I recall correctly, can feel really overwhelming and like the end of the story, when maybe it's not. But all of that being said, they feel like desire and the way that desire is expressed, they're having a set of templates handed to them, maybe particularly to the boys. It's really counterproductive. None of them really like it. And it sounds from what they say that they feel a little bit trapped, like the sort of desire dictator in their world is like these big companies basically that make porn. Which has very little to do with any kind of innate desire. And so I guess I was curious, like, do you feel like for your students, they do kind of feel like their desires are being dictated to them in some way that they kind of don't have control over, or there is some like almost authoritarian presence that's trying to like steer them in certain directions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a perfect description of certainly how a lot of my students feel, especially the men. So I think often the women, the straight women, feel that they have to behave in ways that conform to the expectations and desires of men, and then the men will often complain about a sense of a lack of kind of creative sovereignty over their own desires. The feeling of their sexual desires having been very much formed by something that on its face promises to open up a world of possibility, right? Like the internet, but in fact has the tendency of bringing their desires into conformity with each other. And that's because of the kind of porn young people, especially underage people, watch, which is free porn owned by extremely powerful companies that are, I mean, which run on a very specific algorithm that's entirely about selling stuff to people, right? And so has a very strong interest in making everyone want the same things and watch the same things. And so they're very invested, my students, in the question of like, what would it look like to set their desire free? So they see their desires very much as already formed by a politics, a capitalist, like a late capitalist politics. And they're interested in the question of emancipation. And so they find something salutary in the idea that the relationship to desire could be something more complex than just, well, it is what it is, and it's sort of unchangeable. And I think there is a kind of generational gap here, because it's often when I speak to older people, very often older men, that they will just assert, the unmovability of their desires. I'm always curious to know what their wives think, but.
Right. There's a funny instance of that in the book. I won't give it away. You have to buy the book. But yeah, I mean, it's so interesting because there's also a symmetry with second wave feminists, and Catherine McKinnon makes a big appearance in this book, which I thought was really interesting. For second wave sort of pro-sex feminists, the idea was that pornography was not necessarily bad. Some pornography was, of course, bad, owned by corporations, produced with no real respect for anyone's particular desires, but really just sort of like generated as a consumer product, maybe representing the ideology of the patriarchy, but maybe it's possible to subvert that. And also there's feminist porn, and, they're incredibly creative about, seeking ways for women to express sexuality, to consume, pornography that was produced by women, all sorts of things. And that was considered, maybe the most sexually liberating front of that era of feminism. And so for, a couple generations later, kids to basically be saying these same materials or similar materials or this genre is in some ways like hiding my desires from me, seems like a really interesting and like sad, ironic twist. And
No, I think that's right.
Like McKinnon here, and I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that. I was really interested in.
Yeah, the historical arc is fascinating. So, I mean, I should say that my students are very much not in sympathy with kind of anti-porn feminists like McKinnon or Dworkin when it comes to the question of like what you do about pornography, and specifically whether you should invite the coercive apparatus of the state, against to act against people who make porn and people who work in porn. So they're very against, attempts to legislate sex work in general. But so what they're sympathetic to is the kind of descriptive part of the McKinnon-Dworkin story, the kind of the account of what porn does. Not necessarily the idea that porn is like the linchpin of patriarchy, but rather that pornography has, especially mainstream porn, just is very psychically powerful, and operates in a way that isn't just about, freeing and expressing innate desires, but is actively engaged in the project of shaping them. So my students have this kind of ambivalent relationship to the sex wars, in the sense that, they are sympathetic to the descriptive account that someone like McKinnon or Dworkin wants to give of pornography and of a lot of, I think, sex under patriarchy in general. But they're very instinctively anti-carceral, instinctively very skeptical of the use of state power to remedy kind of sexual injustice. So they find themselves, threading an impossible dilemma, I think. But actually, I think these things actually can be taken apart, and that's part of one of the things I'm trying to do in the book, is to show that you can, you don't have to accept all of this package all at once. I mean, I think one thing that's true of the early sex positivists, I mean, someone like Ellen Willis, I mean, so she saw that there could be certain salutary functions within pornography. She was she was very, she was worried about the way in which anti-porn feminism reinscribed reactionary understandings of female sexuality. But she was also fundamentally worried about the politics, right, of what was happening in what it means in the 80s after under Reagan to be arguing against pornography and to be joining forces with the new right. And I think our context is slightly different, although, obviously there are certain echoes. But for someone like Willis, it wasn't simply that she was interested in defending sort of free expression. I mean, she was interested in the development of genuine sexual countercultures, right? So the destruction of normative sexuality altogether, right? And so you get the creation of a much more egalitarian, diverse sexuality, which would have been a nightmare to the new right. And that dream has been slightly lost, I think, also from the sex positivity side.
Yeah, and one of the things I think is interesting in this book is we've, in the current moment, maybe collapsed into a sort of narrow conversation about sex where it's about pretty much strictly consent. It's what's taught on college campuses. And one reason it is because what colleges are worried about is not so much who's happy, who's having good sex, but are they going to be sued? What is their liability? And so one thing that I think is really great that's happening in this book is sort of pulling us back from that and saying, okay, what other axes can we look at here? And I thought this was particularly compelling in the chapter on professor-student relations, which is one of those things that's gotten a lot of attention, often from people who take like a really hard polemical stance on it, like Laura Kipnis. And there's a lot of talk typically about, the rights of certain people to have the sex that they want to have, whether it's with their professor or their student or whatever. And you make a point, which is essentially like, yeah, like people can have sex, not have sex, but isn't the teacher's job to teach? Like maybe instead of screwing their student, they should teach them. And I wonder if you could unpack a little bit. You give like a sort of mini portrait of what happens when a student is sleeping with a professor, how that transforms the entire institution for them. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that and the ways in which, here is a great example. Consent kind of fails to be a good enough tool for thinking about sex.
Yeah, thanks so much. So, I mean, so when these regulations against professor-student sex started coming into force in the US in the 80s, they were typically justified in the terms of consent. So the idea was that the differential in power between professor and student meant that the student's consent was suspect, questionable. And I just think that That might be true in lots of cases, but there are many cases where that's just not a plausible account of what's going on, right? And in fact, it's very often infantilizing to women students to say that they're incapable of consenting to sex with their professors. I think what's going wrong in those cases has actually has nothing to do with consent. It's that there's a certain kind of promise of the classroom, a promise of the teacher-student relationship. It's in the good case where teaching goes well, where the classroom is a space of pedagogical success, very strong feelings are elicited in students. I mean, sometimes those are very negative feelings like, anger, but very often they're feelings of just sort of inchoate infatuation, exuberance, excitement. And I think lots of us have experienced that when we were students. Lots of academics in particular have experienced it, I think, when they were students. And that's part of why you end up wanting to become an academic. It's because you want to give that feeling to other people. And quite simply, I think it's the responsibility of the professor, as a teacher, to take that desire and exuberance and, to be fairly Platonic about it, kind of redirect it to the object of the classroom, which is learning and understanding and knowledge. And there's a kind of pedagogical failure when a teacher takes that exuberance and either lets himself or makes himself the object of that exuberance. And I think while it's a failure for professors of whatever sex to do this with students of whatever sex, there's a particularly problematic dynamic at play in the majority of cases of professor-student sex, which are between male professors and female students, because women are, on the whole, I think, socialized to think of their desire as it relates to men as desire for men, right? So if I'm sitting in a classroom and I am filled with desire, it must be that I want to sleep with my professor. It couldn't be that I just want to be him. And anyone who's taught in a university has seen this dynamic. And young men, meanwhile, are socialized to think, oh, if I have a strong desire, it's got to be that I want to be him. That produces its own Freudian psychodynamics, the male students who want to kill off their professors. But in the case of the male professor and the female student, I think there's not only a pedagogical failure at work, but also a failure to resist the temptation to take advantage of the thing that patriarchy makes very possible, right?
Yeah, and I think there's something great in that too, which is in what you just put forward. There is the idea that desire can attach itself to different things. It can shift, which is one of the sort of threads through the entire book. I'm going to take some questions now that are not my own. And everyone, please do put your questions in the Q&A box. I would love to read them. So I have one question here from someone who's looking forward to reading the book and writes that it sounds like all of the years of various political and philosophical arguments have led us all right back to Camille Paglia, always a fun place to go, and her arguments about why we can't and shouldn't omit animal desire from the rest of our analysis. Okay, would you agree? A lot to work with there potentially.
Well, okay. I mean, in one sense, yes, that in that we've got, desire, I think, has to be a part of any good feminist analysis. I don't like the phrase animal desire. First of all, I mean, this goes back to octopuses. I don't like the word animal used as a contrast to, human meaning complex and difficult, and animal meaning kind of brute and simple. I think anyone who spent time with animals know that they're actually extremely complex too, and I think can even have quite complex desires. so talking about animal desire as an invitation to a certain kind of reductivism that I just don't think is very helpful. And I think that's certainly true in the human case. So if by animal desire we just mean things like, appetite and want, yes, that has to be part of a political analysis. But I think a thoroughgoing feminism has to give up the fantasy of being able to pinpoint or even theorize about a kind of pre-political desire.
And I have another question here, which is taking off from our conversation about pornography. Oh, and the person who asked that last question says, yes, by animal, I meant appetite and want. And so I feel like that was, you guys were talking to each other. So one person asks, do you think that things your students are taking issue with regard to free, highly commercial porn are a further development of the toxic aspects of porn that some folks criticized in the 80s? I'm curious how you think the media, the internet, as opposed to VHS and films, informs the capacity of porn to manipulate desire in the ways that it does. So has the internet and the sort of omnipresence of porn shifted its ability to affect desire and its tools for doing so?
I think the answer is certainly yes. I mean, I'm sympathetic to those who felt when McKinnon and Dworkin and other anti-porn feminists were making their arguments that there was something sort of, I don't want to use the word hysterical, but exaggerated, disproportionate about their critique, in that, yes, there was porn and porn was available, but you had to go into a CD movie theater, you had to go get a top shelf magazine, and then later you had to get a VHS tape. But what ends up happening, I think, in the age of internet porn is that the anti-porn feminists, in a certain sense, end up looking kind of prescient, because all of a sudden there is a more plausible mechanism for pornography to be able to do the thing that they always claimed it does. So, and I don't think this is very sophisticated. I mean, this is not a very complex issue. I mean, there's just the fact that for the 50% of the world who is online, like, pornography is very easy to access. You can access on your phone, on your computer. It's omnipresent. People have a lot more porn burnout that they self-report, than you did when you just had to have the same VHS tape over and over again. But I don't think we've really come to understand the internet in general, or internet pornography specifically. And we're going to need really great ethnographers of the internet to tell us what's really going on in the future.
Absolutely. And I have a question here, which actually you discuss quite a bit in your book. Do you see any solutions to untangling our desire from politics / white supremacy? Would free sex be free of politics? Should we try to remove politics from sex? Okay, kind of, that's your whole book. I think this question of untangling desire from white supremacy, for example, is something that actually you address in great detail in this book.
Yes. So let me just say that it's not so, I'm not very optimistic about the project of working on desire as such, in a way that's separable from a broader radical politics. So I don't think it makes sense to think about disentangling desire from white supremacy while not also dismantling white supremacy. What I really hope to show is that we should take seriously desire as one mechanism and vehicle of white supremacy. And your work won't be done in ending white supremacy until desire has been liberated from racism as well. So I'm very interested in the way in which, so I'll just say a little bit maybe about the way I think of white supremacy and specifically anti-Black racism shaping desire. So one thing that's very important is that while I often talk about the way that politics shapes desire, what I'm really interested in is the way in which politics shapes hierarchies of desirability, perceived desirability, which are status hierarchies, which actually come apart from the question of who is in fact desired and not desired, which also in turn comes apart from who is and is not having sex. So if you think about, for example, the position of Black women, someone like Angela Davis has been, pointing out for a very long time the way in which Black women are at once coded as unrapeable, right? Sexually promiscuous that they can't be raped, and therefore are made actually materially susceptible to rape at much higher rates, so are made maximally rapeable. And so what you have are a group of people who can be assigned a low status, right, in terms of a standard white hierarchy of sexual desirability, who nonetheless are the objects of very intense sexual desire, fetishization, and abuse, right? So thinking about, and then there's another story to be told about men of color and Black men in particular, and a different story about Asian women and Asian men. Yeah, but I think that this stuff is there's a lot to be said about the interactions of racism and desire. But I also think that it doesn't really make sense to be trying to eradicate racism from desire without thinking of that as a part of a broader project of just dismantling racism as such.
So one other question I have here, this person wonders if you could talk a little bit about your thoughts on the role of asexuality as a trait that some men and women and queer folks identify with, and how that might shape social and power structures. So what is happening when there is, when there is not desire, I guess is sort of the question.
Yes, or not desire in this specific way, right? So you can have strong desires for friendship, for affinity, for communion, for solidarity, but maybe not desire for forms of sexual interaction with other people. Seems totally normal to me and very understandable. But of course, it's thought of as like pathological, right? So I mean, in a culture in which sex is seen as a status good, or at least sex with certain people, with certain kinds of bodies is seen as something that accrues status, those people who just are seeming to like opt out of the sexual economy altogether are not really believed, right? So either they're going to be assigned a low status, well, I mean, either way, they're going to be assigned a low status because the thought is going to be, well, it can't really be that there is no desire here. What there is an inability to compete, right, in the sexual marketplace, which then has to be understood. So what you have is a kind of failure. I mean, this is just a great example of the failure of the so-called sexual revolution, right, which was supposed to have set all of us sexually free, but in fact, which isn't to discount it at all. I mean, there's a lot that was very hard won in the 60s, and we certainly should be, especially when it comes to the rights to have multiple sexual partners, to have other forms of non-normative sex, non-marital sex, non-reproductive sex. But at the same time, what hasn't been loosened, I think, is the sense of sex as something that accrues status, right? What's different, what has changed, and at least especially changed for men, has been how exactly that economy functions, and how status accrues to different players in it. And I think the situation of asexual people who are just routinely disbelieved and denied is a fantastic example of the profound limitations of the so-called sexual revolution.
And I'm going to ask one last question. I know it's something like 11 o'clock where you are. So we have a broad question to sort of close out. Given the social discourse that your book has introduced, would you be able to impart some thoughts about how society might change in the next few years? And that's very broad. So what I would like to say is something, ever-present characters in your book are your students. And I suppose maybe if I'm not imposing too much on this question, sort of ask, when you, as you've been working on this book and teaching at the same time, do you see sort of directions that your students are taking, for example, or contrasts in the way that you look at things versus your students that suggest some ways that, some interesting things that might be changing, some things that you're maybe still thinking about? Or maybe you've solved everything, which would be fabulous.
No. So I'm in a situation where my students very often give me hope, but they, I think with good reason, very often feel quite hopeless. And my students are in the least hopeless position of lots, or one of the least hopeless positions of lots of people of their generation. They're staring down total ecological crisis, economic crisis, spiraling inequality. I mean, it's at the same time, it's produced in them a level of political consciousness that is exciting. We have a very radicalized but weak conservative, majority in this country and in the US. Yeah, so it feels like something very good could happen, but it feels also like nothing might. I was just thinking about Lux, which is another thing that gives me a great deal of hope. I think one thing I can say is that I think the pandemic has been very good for getting us to focus more on questions that have so long preoccupied socialist feminists, which really should just be central to any kind of political conversation about the next few years and for the ongoing future, about social reproduction and about what it looks like for a society to value the actual work that goes into reproducing human life and making it not just survive but flourish, to use the phrase that Sarah used earlier. And feminists, historically and contemporary feminists, offer great resources for thinking through those things. And I think, and they really resonate with my students, which is, I think, part of why I have hope. They're all kind of instinctive socialists, I think, because the crisis in which they find themselves just demands that. But I think it's very dangerous to place hope in a future generation. It's got to be us who do these things. I refuse to, to pin my hope on them, because that's what everyone does.
Yeah, absolutely. Hearing full-fledged adults with power in the world saying like, Gen Z, they're going to save us. I'm like, that is really unfair.
No, we have to save them. Yeah, sorry, yeah. That's a very negative note on which to end.
It's madness. But that being said, in this book, we have one more tool to think through these questions. It's a wonderful book. It sounds like everyone in the chat is already eager to read it. But it is a wonderful book. I hope, everyone picks it up tonight.